Hello, I'm Jeff Livingston, the historian for the Hawaiian Railway Society. In this particular installment about the railroads in Hawaii, we're going to talk a little bit about stations. The Oahu Railway and Land Company, as they developed across, beginning in Honolulu toward ʻEwa, out to Waipahu, continuing on to Kahuku, and eventually the branch line, the Wahiawa branch, up to Schofield Barracks and Wahiawa, and the pineapple fields beyond, of course, had a number of stations. Now, what is a station? Well, there are a couple of different kinds. Some are actual physical buildings, 1 and 2 story, and others were simply sheds. Like a bus waiting shed, but they were still considered stations. Now we're fortunate that we have a good list of these stations and their descriptions from a document that was required by the Interstate Commerce Commission, documenting the reproduction costs of the railroad, and that was published in 1914. Now, obviously, things changed in between, but the earliest stations were not necessarily retained as the railroad grew and expanded, and in some cases was realigned. So it's a constantly shifting landscape. The other item of interest is that a number of these stations had associated freight sheds. Some areas had just a freight shed and no station, and the infrastructure developed by the railroad to support the operations, the buildings, the houses, the cottages, the camps, the water towers, the oil tanks, are all documented in this ICC report. And it's a fascinating look at the railroad at that particular time. Now, when the railroad began, the first station built in Honolulu was in 1889, and this was a wood frame building, extremely good looking. And this is the front of the building, and the tracks were located on the other side or to the rear. Now, the building just behind that, just beyond it, that was actually one of the first equipment sheds, and there were no locomotive facilities per se, but there was an area for the passenger cars and what few freight cars were available. On the opposite side, where the tracks are, this is where the trains would be boarded. Now, this entire area was fill. This was part of the fill brought from Moanalua. And in this photograph, you see the earliest passenger cars and locomotives of the OR&L, and this is circa 1889, 1890. This particular station was actually moved at one point to increase the size of the yard and the available space. I don't recall exactly how far it was moved, but the entire building was picked up and relocated. Now, this wasn't a huge distance, obviously, but it was actually relocated prior to the construction of the new station. The new station, which is still in existence downtown on King Street, it was built in 1925, and this is the one that most people are familiar with. This obviously is a wartime picture. trying to sell war bonds. This is kind of a Spanish style tile roof. As I said, it still stands. And if you look very carefully, it says Oahu Railway on the right side above the 4 arches. We are very pleased at the Hawaiian Railway Society. We were able to recover all of those letters, and our intention is to reinstall them within our museum when that museum is constructed. Hopefully we'll get started on that in the not too distant future, but it won't be immediate by any means. This is the rear of the depot. Now you can see the platforms right in the center of the picture. It looks kind of like a Y. There were 2 covered platforms, and at the peak of operations, the train would come in. Now it came in locomotive first and would stop at the far end. There's 2 very large concrete blocks which still exist down there, and that was station 0. That is the point from which all measurements of the OR&L were taken. So the train would come into this station, locomotive first, stop, unload, and unloading took usually 5 minutes or less because everybody was in a hurry. It was not uncommon during the war for passengers to be bailing out of the windows and off the platforms before the train ever came to a stop. A second locomotive would attach to the rear of the passenger cars, pull it out of the way, allowing the locomotive in the front to escape, and then shove the passenger train back into the platform, and it was ready to go back again. Total turnaround time for a fully loaded passenger train during the war could be as little as 10 minutes. Come in full, discharge, change, well, actually probably closer to 15 minutes, but repower and leave again. Now I mentioned sheds, and this is one of the typical sheds that would have been seen in the early days and later days of the Oahu Railway. This Moanalua station or station shed was on a section of the line that was abandoned due to a realignment. When the original alignment of the OR&L was constructed, the engineer wanted to go one way and Dillingham wanted to go another. Dillingham was trying to pick up freight and traffic to make a profit, and the engineer, a fellow named Krugel, was trying to keep the road as level and with as little amount of work to construct it as possible. In this case, Dillingham won, and it wasn't until a number of years later excuse me, that the railroad was realigned, and this particular shed was no longer needed or in use. The first actual station after the Honolulu depot was Puʻeloa. Now, Puʻeloa is in the upper left there. That design is one of the standard OR&L designs for a station. This was built in 1898. In this particular photograph, the tracks being laid that you see are a branch line going into Hickam and to reach Fort Kamehameha. Puʻeloa was the station that served the Navy Yard initially, and then from the Navy Yard there was a line that ran further to Watertown, which was in existence while the Navy Yard was being constructed. Once that construction was completed, the Navy took over all of the trackage within the Navy Yard, and the OR&L did not venture to the Navy Yard except an outlying area to unload and load passengers and then freight. Freight was stored or dropped off at a number of sidings, and then the Navy's locomotives would move the freight cars within the Navy Yard as needed. So this one was going to service Hickam and Fort Kamehameha, which had originally been served through Watertown. Aiea Station, which was built in 1911, is an interesting design. It is identical to the Waipahu station, and we'll be looking at Waipahu in just a moment here. But Aiea was a significant station, as it served the far end of the naval base, naval station, and it was through Aiea that most of the Liberty parties departed and returned to the naval station. Puʻaloa was more for the Navy Yard, and Aiea served the rest of the naval station. Now, one of the differences between this particular station and Puʻaloa, say, this actually had accommodations for a station master. The ground floor was your ticket office and general waiting room, and the upper floor was the residence of the station manager. It consisted of a small kitchen, bedroom, living room, and bathroom. Not much more than that. But keep in mind that this is identical in design to Waipahu, and I'm asking you to keep that in mind because there's an interesting difference that we'll talk about when we get to Waipahu. The Pearl City Station, which served the Pearl City Peninsula, was built in 1890. This is one of the earlier pictures of it. It is far more ornate than the Aiea station, and of course it was built earlier by 8 years. This was one of the attempts at the OR&L to generate more income through passenger traffic, taking people to the peninsula and in that same area, Redmond Grove, and even led somewhat to the establishment of the funeral trains and the funeral cars that served in the same general area, although we have never completely assuredly located the sidings for the funeral cars or the actual location of the cemetery. Now, moving on to Waipahu, originally Waipahu was built circa 1898, and you see in the upper left there, that's the original Waipahu depot or station, and it is identical in design to the Puʻaloa station. So this was a common thread among the OR&L and most railroads at the time. They had a standard design for stations, a standard design for signaling. Anything they could do to standardize equipment made it easier. But Waipahu looks far different than this today, obviously. This particular station was replaced by the second Waipahu station in 1911. However, this station did not disappear. It was physically moved and set up in Honolulu as a station there in 1911 when the new Waipahu depot was built, and this was built concurrently with the station at Aiea. Now you see that they are virtually identical. Waipahu did have a manually operated semaphore because it was also a junction. Waipahu is where the line, the branch line for Wahiawa split. So it needed a method to alert trains if there were changes in orders or anything else. Other than that, these two designs, Aiea and Waipahu, were identical, with the exception of how the station master's quarters were laid out. Because of the prevailing winds, the bathroom was located at the leeward side of the prevailing wind. So the fresh air would come in through the living quarters, bedroom, and exit through the bathroom. Because of the differences in location between Aiea and Waipahu, the living quarters were laid out exactly opposite. So if the bathroom was in the right corner at Aiea, it would be in the left corner at Waipahu. So they were definitely thinking ahead. And I mentioned earlier some of the other structures that were part of the infrastructure. You can see in this photograph a water tank, and then just behind it, that little eave, that's actually a freight shed. ʻEwa Mill was constructed in 1898, and it too is the same design as Puʻuloa, and the original Waipahu moved to Honolulu. ʻEwa Mill Station was right at the intersection now. If you come down Renton Road where it crosses, I forget the name of the road, but it's comes off the north-south road. But that junction, just a little mauka, is where this station originally stood. Obviously, the cane fields are long gone, and none of this exists anymore. Just as a kind of an illustration, this is the Nanakuli shelter. This was actually part of a rest camp, I believe, but the station had been there for, or the shelter had been there for a long period of time prior to that becoming a rest and recreation area for the military. This particular design of station, essentially an open shed, and I believe there were up to 16 at various times on the OR&L, these open shed stations. We hope to use a similar design to shelter our displays at the railroad once we get our new station built in our museum, not only to protect the equipment, but to make the experience of visiting the yard a little more enjoyable in the hot of the sun. Waianae was the next station, and it was a different design, but significant in that it is two-story. It also has, you can see the freight shed just opposite the locomotive there, but the station is primarily what we're interested in here. At these stations, they had the station masters. Tickets could be purchased, freight could be shipped, messages could be sent. If you boarded the train anywhere other than a station with a station master who sold tickets, you bought your ticket from the conductor and you paid a surcharge for that ticket. At one time it was as much as 10 cents extra. Now, whether or not this lasted through the entirety of the OR&L's operations, we're unsure. There are just thousands of unanswered questions that we have been unable to find answers for. So if you have any additional information, we would absolutely love to hear from you. Waialua Station didn't look like much. This is toward the end of the operations, and as I said, the passenger service had become quite spotty and was run primarily with the motor cars instead of full-fledged passenger trains, except for the Kodak camera tours and the Haleiwa specials. So a lot of these stations kind of fell into some degree of disrepair. The last major station on the primary main line was Kahuku. And this is an early photograph of Kahuku, probably around 1899, 1900. And here again you can see a freight shed just behind the station and a water tank in the background. Kahuku also was home to an engine shed because the last train from Honolulu would stop in Kahuku at the end of its run and stay overnight, and became the first train from Kahuku back to Honolulu the next morning. There were a few stations on the Wahiawa branch, but there was one at Wahiawa. This was built probably around 1904. We don't have an exact date for it, but it served Wahiawa, and it remained there well after the railroad stopped passenger service. They were still hauling pineapple and freight, but it was taken over by a restaurateur and served for a number of years. And my understanding is that it did catch fire at some point, the restaurant, and is no longer with us, unfortunately. Now, this was the only other major station on the Wahiawa branch. However, there were station sheds, and there was a station at Kastner. Now, Kastner, you can see, this is probably one of the better pictures of that standard OR&L design, where you didn't have a two-story or station master. You would most likely, if there was sufficient traffic, see a station of this design. Now, the Oahu Railway built one other station, at Lelehua, and somewhere I have a photograph of it. This was at the very end of the line at Schofield Barracks, but I was unable to find it as I was searching for this particular presentation. Now, at the rail yard of the Hawaiian Railway Society, we do not have a station right now. We operate out of an old Quonset hut. However, we agreed to stop our forward progress at a given point to allow Farrington Highway left turn lanes to be installed, which limit the amount of available space that operate a train on the existing track. So we agreed to stop any of our forward progress at that point, and in return, under a Section 106 agreement, we were granted $1 million to build a new station and a freight shed museum and potentially a display building. This has been tied up through a number of reasons for a number of years, and so far nothing has occurred. We have taken on the museum on our own and are going to pursue that. And the state and city are working on getting the permit for the station so construction can begin on it. Now, this station will look very similar to the Waipahu depot or Waipahu station. It will be of similar design, although its proportions are going to be different due to the needs of the Hawaiian Railway Society. It will have expanded ground floor area for a gift shop, ticket sales, and public restrooms. And up above, there will be spaces for the crew and meeting spaces and other uses, possibly the archives, until they can get a museum building where we can store the archives in the museum building. We hope this will come to fruition sooner rather than later. It's been about, I think, almost 15 years we've been waiting for it, and hopefully by the end of the year we'll have a resolution on the building permit, and the job can go out for bids and construction can start sometime within the next however long. We've learned to be patient, and we'll wait. As always, if you have an interest in trains or an interest in history, please come visit us. We do operate five trains every week, one on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 on Saturdays at noon and at 3, and 2 on Sundays at 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. It's a narrated tour, and although there's no more cane fields and everything else to see, there's still a lot of history, and you're riding on some of the original rails of the Oahu Railway and Land Company that were laid down well over 100 years ago. We're hoping to see Renton Road become a historic corridor with the Hawaiian Railway Society as the anchor. There is a lot of history along that road. There's a lot of history in Verona Village. We'd like to see all of that developed. The Hawaii or Evan Mill Plantation Manager's House is one of the items that we would love to see someone take that on to restore and bring back to glory. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.